talking through. She's in the car with me, so I'm talking through a mask,
Oh,
and
right.
and I'm also talking through the speaker system.
Okay. Yeah, because it sounds like you have like a stuffy nose a little bit.
Talking through. She's in the car with me,
Right.
so I'm talking through a mask,
Oh, right.
and I'm also talking through the speaker system.
It'll be fine. Don't worry.
Well, that's interesting. That just repeated itself. I said that about a minute ago.
That's very weird. Oh,
So,
you know what? It's because I was connecting to YouTube and it may have been on a delay.
okay.
Because when you click into YouTube, it's very weird. That's why you have to like then shut down the volume on YouTube or you'll hear everything twice.
Okay. Anyway, I'm with you. I'll just be in the background and I'll probably keep it on pretty much on mute.
Okay, very
So
good.
you don't hear the driving noises.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if we'll get anybody else. People are busily getting ready for Passover. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, my wife's out right now, so she won't be on.
Right.
Okay. Talk to you later.
Okay, very good.
Hey, Tim.
Hello, how are you?
Okay, well, you got a different background. Where you moved?
No, I'm sitting at my dining room table.
Oh,
Normally, I'm sitting at my desk because Caleb is busy doing things in the house, and so I just go in there and shut the door. But he actually he rarely works on Friday, but he had to work today to cover for somebody who's on vacation. So I thought, oh, I can be in the dining room today. It's a little more relaxing.
Oh, okay, good, good.
So yeah, this is the dining room. Well, you can see into the kitchen and the pass through to the kitchen and whatever.
Boy, Georgia is really in the news.
Oh, good Lord, for all the wrong reasons.
Isn't that incredible? You know, and it was right after Biden made that the press conference, which I thought was so good.
Right.
I watched it, but you know, and he made those comments about voting and stuff, and I mean, it was just really like a slap in the face.
It really is. And it's just so flies in the face of what a democracy is supposed to be. You know, we're supposed to encourage people to vote and make it, you know, something that people can do without a lot of strenuous effort. And, you know, 43 states are trying to limit, you know, voting. I mean, it's voter suppression. It's all it is. I mean, I find it very disheartening. I must be honest. I find it very
No, it is just absolutely incredible. So what do you think? It'll go to the Supreme Court?
Well, I know that the ACLU has already filed a case against it.
Mm-hmm.
So who knows where that will go? I could see it going all the way to the Supreme Court, but apparently there's some case coming up in the Supreme Court that deals with voting, and it's going to be interesting to see how that turns out, given the more conservative bent of the court now.
Yeah. Well, the most alarming thing about it, I mean, the water is really despicable, you know, all that kind of stuff. That's really in the silliness category, right?
It is.
But the possibility of them overturning the, you know, the voters.
Right.
I mean, by appointing their own delegate, their own electors. I mean, that.
So then what it's like comes down to then what does an election mean then? You know, if things can be overturned, then what does it mean when we actually go and vote?
Yeah.
It's the will of the people, and sometimes it may not be the way you want it to go, and you accept it and you wait for the next round and try to get your people elected. That's how it works.
Yeah.
Now I find it's very demoralizing. I mean, here we were on such a, you know, high with going blue for Biden and getting the 2 senators and all of that. And this is a direct reaction to that. They're just overturning it because they don't want to see this happen again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think, you know, the whole thing is rigged anyway in favor of the Republicans, the way the Senate is set up.
Yeah.
You know, with the way the voting in the Senate and two votes from every state, you know, regardless of population and stuff.
Right.
So it's a rigged kind of thing anyway to start with. And then they have the filibuster thing, which makes it even more rigged.
Right.
You know, and now the gerrymandering for the state, you know, the way they're setting up each of the districts and stuff. So.
Yeah, you look at some of the outlines of some of the districts in the House of Representatives, and they're the most ridiculous, you know, with little lines going here and then stuck down to a little piece over there. And who thinks this stuff up other than they're trying to figure out a way that even without having a majority registration of voters, they can still win elections.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's
incredible. It's very, very, very upsetting to think that this is what we're wasting our legislative time on. You know, rather than having, you know, there's so much that needs attention, both in the state as well as nationally in the country, but we're going to waste time on figuring out ways to keep people from voting. Something's just not right here. It's just not right. You know, but and then of course we have the whole brouhaha that's going on in Israel right now too.
Yeah, it looks like it's another stalemate.
Yep. It certainly does. So it looks like it could go back to another election fairly soon and Netanyahu is making friends with a lot of really very, very interesting people who I don't know. It's just very disheartening to look over there, but nobody's got a plurality and coalitions. I don't know. Oh, well, let's get to the Torah portion for the week. Jeff is with us, but he's driving, so you won't see him because he needs to keep his eyes on the road, of course, which I always recommend when you're driving. It's always a good thing to do, to keep your eyes on the road. I'm never say or feel good being in a car when someone is not looking at the road. And I'm one of those really, really weird people. I won't answer my phone while I'm driving. I won't look at it. My attention goes to driving. I don't want to even for a split second And so if someone calls me while I'm driving, they either leave me a message or they'll call me back, or it must not have been that important. So, call me crazy, but that's me. All right, so we're continuing on in Leviticus, which we have started now. There will be a special Torah portion related to the holiday next week, which will sort of come in the interim as we're moving through Leviticus. But because Passover has not started yet, it does not start till tomorrow evening with the first Seder, we continue on with our normal cycle of Torah readings. So this is a parasha called Tzav. It takes us from Leviticus chapter 6, verse 1 to chapter 8, verse 36. And once again, we find ourselves challenged to find some kind of modern relevance in a very detailed description of sacrifices and offerings and by the newly ordained high priest at the temple. This portion offers us the differences between the various sacrifices and the meanings behind each one. And within this description of offerings and ordination to the high priesthood, there are a few ideas that we can pull out that really can deserve our consideration, even though we are not offering sacrifices and we are not in temple Judaism any longer. We can start by just looking at the title of this portion, the word Tzav. The word Tzav. In Hebrew, the word Tzav means command. Now, in earlier readings from the Torah, when God is speaking to Moses, Tzav is not the verb that is used. The idea of a command carries with it a much stronger imperative than a word such as speak or tell or direct. But here we have the word Tzav. God is commanding Moses and Aaron in the precise ways that the temple sacrifices are to be carried out. Now, why would God need this strong verb in explaining the exactness of the priestly duties? Does God fear that somehow his wishes will not be properly carried out if he doesn't command? Well, I certainly don't know, because I don't know God's will. But the Torah gives something of a hint about God's strength of language here. Two of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, are struck dead for failing to follow the exact ritual of the commanded sacrifices. They take it upon themselves to offer an additional sacrifice of their own choosing, not one that was commanded by God, a sacrifice that is not mentioned in the sacrificial rubric. For this infraction, for taking it upon themselves to offer their own sacrifice above and beyond what they've been commanded to do, God is angered to the point of punishing them by death. Now, exactly how and why these two men decided to offer an additional sacrifice is not made clear to us. The Torah doesn't really tell us. It doesn't clarify it for us. What we can glean from this action, however, is that God is expecting some very precise carrying out of his command when it comes to the sacrifices. If you veer away from that command, the penalty is going to be severe, death. Because we are not given any details as to the exact deviation that Nadab and Abihu practiced, it's hard for us to judge them and their motives, as well as God and God's motives. However, this seems to be a very steep price to pay for offering an additional sacrifice to God. Also, as one rabbinic commentator pointed out, the word tzav is from the same root as the word mitzvah. Though many of us today interpret this word mitzvah to be synonymous with a good deed or an act of kindness, in truth, the word mitzvah does in fact mean a commandment. We know that our sages speak of 613 mitzvot that we are commanded to follow throughout the Torah. We also are very aware, as modern Jews, that many of these 613 mitzvot no longer have any bearing on the way that we live our lives today. Yet, if they are truly commandments, how can we easily just dismiss those commandments from God that do not fit into our modern daily lives? Are we permitted to pick and choose only those that make sense to us and permit us to live a fully 21st century life? It is easy to tell the story of the Exodus, and it's easy to eat matzah on Passover, two of the mitzvot that we are commanded to carry out. But how many of us sincerely And seriously, look at the labels in our clothing to be certain that they do not mix wool and linen, which is mitzvot number 367. How many of us make certain to offer up two lambs to God on each Shabbat, which is mitzvah number 537? Many of the 613 relate back to a Judaism that we no longer practice in the year 2021. So it seems sort of inconsequential that we no longer follow them. But the fact remains that in those sacrifices, in this portion, God is commanding a strict adherence as to how they are to be carried out. Now, it seems that God clearly wants the people, in this case through the actions of the high priest, to set aside something and some time to be sure that they do in fact honor God. Does this suggest an arrogant God who is begging to be worshipped? Well, I'll leave that for you to decide. What does seem to be relevant here is that we are commanded to do something in honor of God. Whether it be for us today through prayer or through our actions, we should not be so arrogant as to think that we are no longer in need of God. We can pray on our own. We can attend synagogue services, when the synagogue reopens, of course. We can carry out acts of loving kindness, known as Gimilut Chasadim, to show honor to God. If our practice of Judaism has had to evolve with the times, then we must consider that God's expectations of us have also evolved with the times. None of us can pretend to know what God is thinking, but it seems logical to place our faith and trust in a God who has given us the ability to think problems through and to come to solutions to those problems, as a God who does understand that his people and society in general are going to change in their habits and in their practices. As Jews, we do not believe it is necessary to hide ourselves away from the world in order to understand what God desires of us. On the contrary, it is by being in the world and of the world, and by acting as an example to the world, that we best honor God. We are to be a light to the nations, as the Torah commands us. It is hard to be that light if we are locked away behind closed doors. In order for a light to be effective, it must shine forth and it must shine brightly. And when we shine our individual lights, that is how we best give honor to God. So, questions, thoughts, comments? All this.
It is puzzling. I mean, the story of Aaron's sons is puzzling. Do we know what it was that they did that was beyond the commandment that they were doing?
It's just that they put something else on the altar, and the smoke rose to God. Again, it's not entirely clear in the Torah, but it seems they just decided that, well, if we've offered God a sacrifice, what would be wrong with offering another sacrifice to God? They weren't offering something that was blemished from what we know, or anything that was, unclean. So they just thought, here's one sacrifice. What could be the harm in an additional sacrifice? But God didn't proclaim that sacrifice. He didn't put that in the list of sacrifices the high priests are to carry out, and therefore he got angry. Who do you think you are, I guess, to add an additional sacrifice that I didn't tell you about? Which seems, as I said, it seems very, very vengeful for God to strike them dead simply because they thought they were doing something very good by offering something additional to honor God. It's very, very puzzling to me.
Yeah, you can carry it to the next thought level of, supposing, a person wants to do more then one commandment says, he wants to go a step further. Maybe the commandment says donate 10% of your wealth or something. He wants to donate 11% or right. Something. Is that a violation? I mean, it's just such a silly kind of argument to even make. You kind of wonder why they put that in the Bible. If it did happen, who knows if it happened.
Right. But I mean, clearly there was something that we would have to assume that they were trying to illustrate by including this in the Torah. So, and we get their names. We get the names of the two sons. That we get. even though we don't get a great deal of detail about what they've done or what they specifically offered, but we get their names and we know that they are struck dead for what they did. And like you said, if somebody, wants to do more, it would be like somebody coming to Mikveh Israel and saying, okay, here's my dues, but I would like to do more. And the board or the rabbi says, oh, no, 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 no. We don't want more. Don't give us more. I don't think that's going to happen. I think, if somebody wants to do more, give more, offer more, whatever the case may be, the rabbi is going to be very pleased by that. The board will be pleased. And, why not if you have the means to do so?
But maybe they would be looked upon as zealots, and anything in excess, really excess, would go against what God would want.
Right. And Judaism is not a religion that looks upon zealotry very kindly. I mean, there have been, groups of Jews who were considered to be more zealous. In fact, there's something, I believe actually it's in this Torah portion. The Nazarites, there is a story about the Nazarites who are the closest thing I've ever found in the Torah or in Jewish history to being what in Christianity and in Roman Catholicism would be sort of almost like cloistered, like monks or cloistered nuns. They do choose to sort of shut themselves off, but they don't do it like, when you join as a monk or something, you pledge to be a monk for life. You take vows and that's supposed to be your life for the rest of the time. This is for like a 1-year period, or you can go longer than a year. They are not permitted to drink wine. They don't interact with the other members of the community. And yet they really weren't looked upon as being any greater than anyone else. And there is even a line in the Torah that says that, going longer than a year is really not looked at as a favorable thing. If you want to join the Nazarites, you do it for 1 year and then you move on and you come back to the community. But I mean, because we don't have that in Judaism. We don't have this sort of cloistering away, where, your soul, everything about your sole purpose is to pray for the good of the world or the earth or whatever. That's just not a Jewish concept. As I said, we are commanded to be in the world and doing acts that are good deeds for the world. I mean, the whole tikkun olam, you can't really repair the world if you're not in the world.
In most of the other cases where God is about to do something, he kind of reveals his intention first. And then there's kind of like a discussion or argument between himself and Moses, or himself and, somebody to talk him out of, something like that. If there was only one, righteous person, would you still destroy Sodom and Gomorrah?
Right.
That kind of thing. But here he doesn't even look for a discussion of it. He just goes ahead and he does it. How does Aaron react? Do we have any clue in the Torah portion?
No, and that's the other thing is it just seems like, okay, they've been struck dead, and then the community moves on. There's not a great deal of reaction other than, I guess they're made an example of, don't go beyond what you've been commanded to do, what God has commanded of you. It's to me such an odd. The fact that it's even in the Torah is odd. And like I said, things are in the Torah, at least if we believe our rabbis and sages, they're all there for a reason. There's not supposed to be anything there that's extraneous, just there to be there. But it's very puzzling as to why. And, I think zealotry, as Jane said, maybe we're, don't go overboard. Do what you're commanded to do and if you do that well, then you're doing enough and that's pleasing to God. But, that makes as much sense to me as anything else I can think of. When I ponder this, I think, I would not want to be punished for thinking that I'm doing something more and that it's something good. I mean, if I were doing something more and it was underhanded or whatever, that's a whole different story. But this wasn't. Yes.
Jim, if the sacrifice was that of an animal, and it was my understanding that the priests do get what's left over, then they would be doing it for themselves, and maybe that's why.
This was actually, though, a grain sacrifice.
Okay.
From what we can tell, they had done they did the offering of flour and grain, and then they offered additional flour and grain beyond what they were commanded to offer. So they did not slaughter, another lamb or another animal and offer that, because that could be looked at as being a bit self-serving, because we get to, for our meal, we get the remains of after the sacrifice. But, this is something that pretty much goes up in smoke, like when you're cooking and you burn flour, you can't really use it. I mean, I guess you could, but it wouldn't taste very good. So yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things that, there's a lot of things in the Torah that puzzle us, but I find this one just one of the most puzzling of all.
Here comes the answer. Jeff Caffey has
the answer because he knew them. He was friends with them.
Oh, I quite agree with you. That is one of the more puzzling things I've read before, and never could understand it. And if it's a reaction to teach us not to be zealots, it certainly seems to be an overreaction by God, striking down somebody who isn't really being, let's say, intentionally disrespectful.
Right.
So I never could understand it, and it'd be interesting to see how each of the branches of Judaism explains that.
Right. Yeah. I should try to find what the Orthodox commentary might say on this, what their logic or thinking behind it might be, because it's there and it's something we have to deal with. We can't sort of pretend like it's not there. And Larry, as you said, in the past, when God would get angry, somebody was always able to sort of talk him down or talk God out of the anger. But there's no opportunity for that here. There's no way that anybody can intervene and say, hey, wait a minute. These guys were doing something that they thought was honorable to God. So aren't you being just a little bit, talk about zealous, aren't you being a little overzealous and just immediately deciding that to take their lives, and they're going to pay with their lives for it?
Does Plowd have a comment?
Certainly not. And certainly not eye for an eye.
I'm hearing two things.
Does Plowd have a comment on it? Do you know?
Not really. That's any satisfying beyond what I've already said. So I should find the Orthodox commentary. I don't have a copy of that. I have a copy of the Conservative, and I have a copy of the Reform, but I don't have a copy of any kind of really Orthodox commentary. And there are probably several out there. But it would, it's like we're all going to celebrate, Seder, either virtually or with people or whatever, and we have the commandments of the things we do as we go through the Seder. And so, if we, it would be like God getting upset because, I'm sorry, I ate an extra piece of matzah, I wasn't supposed to at this point, but I was a little hungry, so I ate a little more matzah than I was supposed to.
Tim?
Yes.
Tim, the interesting thing also, I was just thinking now about commentaries. Of course, Christianity looks back on the our Torah, or Old Testament, as they would call it. Do they make commentaries on things like this too? Is there a written responsa within the Christian community?
Most Christian commentaries focus mostly on the New Testament and the differences like between the Gospels, where the Gospels contradict one another. You've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they don't always agree. And they don't focus really much on the Torah and the Hebrew scripture. They are more, they want everything. And when they do focus, because occasionally you'll get something, they have this attempt to Christianize everything. They take Hebrew scripture and they try to see in it some connection to Jesus, whatever it might be. I mean, I just recently, I posted something on our Facebook and I thought I might get flack for it, because there's something that happens every year at this time, and it's churches that Christianize the Seder. Christian churches will have a Seder and they Christianize it. They put Christological references and into the Haggadah. There are even Christianized Haggadot out there that have Christian references. And I, for one, just find it appalling. Maybe I'm overreacting, but I just find it appalling that they do this. And so there was a great article in the foreword about please don't have a Christian Seder. You know, if you want to know the Seder, invite somebody from the Jewish community in who is knowledgeable to explain the themes and to explain what it's all about, and use a Jewish Haggadah. Don't use a Christianized Haggadah. Because there's this belief out there that Jesus was celebrating a Seder at the Last Supper, and that's entirely false. It's entirely false. There was no such thing as a Seder when Jesus was alive. The Seder hadn't even come into being yet. Okay, I have my piece, but it's just something that gets under my skin every year. I won't talk about it anymore.
Oh,
Didn't really start it.
Anyway, you know, so we've got this whole Leviticus, and we've got beyond this, you know, again, we've got all these sacrifices. And I think it is interesting, though, too, that the evolution of the word mitzvah. You know, mitzvah means commandment. But most people today, when they hear the word mitzvah, they think of a good deed, you know, an act of kindness. You know, synagogues have mitzvah day. And on mitzvah day, we go out and we do things for the community. We work perhaps with other, you know, groups and organizations for the betterment of our community, not just the Jewish community, but the community at large, because we're doing good deeds. But it's actually does mean commandment rather than good deeds. So, you know, I mean, I realize that words do undergo evolutionary, you know, changes in meaning. It happens all the time. It's just as words come into the language and words drop out of the language at times. But it's kind of interesting, so that this tzav, this Torah portion, is from the root that does mean mitzvah and does mean commandment. And we have these 613 commandments, many of which are, as I said, very irrelevant to us today. And I've often wanted to ask somebody who is Orthodox, I've never done it, but I've always wanted to say, so how do, you know, we're supposed to be doing the 613 commandments. How does Orthodoxy, you know, deal with those that are impossible to carry out because we don't have temple sacrifice anymore?
Well, aren't they waived? I thought that there were, you know, in other words, they count them up and they say so many of them were only in temple time. So many of them only were because you live in Jerusalem, so that they've somehow been able to segregate the commandments into several different groups, stating, you know, not that they're not important, but that they are not relevant at this time until the you know, the temple has been reconstructed, the Messiah comes, and things of that nature. So I thought that's the way that they could kind of get around the 613 and boil it down to maybe 250 or something.
Right. Well, and I know that you know, that they still retain in their liturgy the prayers praying for the rebuilding of the temple, so that once again, you know, we will have a temple in Jerusalem. Whereas, you know, in conservative and Reform Judaism, we have pretty much excised that out of the liturgy. We're no longer hoping and praying for a temple. We have our synagogues and we have our community centers, and etc. So maybe their idea of praying for the return of it is also a way of trying to honor those commandments that aren't relevant, but we're still praying that someday, you know, they will become relevant again when a temple is rebuilt and all of that is reinstated. But, you know,
historically, do we have a better idea of when the first Seder was? I know that the first Haggadah that they found, that they think they found, was like an 8th century, I think, in Cairo.
Right, and that
I don't know if that's about the earliest of the.
From what I did a little research into this, into the whole notion of the Seder. The beginnings of anything that would even resemble a Seder, not necessarily a Haggadah yet, but that would resemble a Seder, the earliest they have any kind of record of it historically is about 125 to 150 years after the time when the death of Jesus. There was some attempt to celebrate Passover with, sort of beginnings of what would be incorporated into a more full-fledged Seder. My reading said that the full-fledged Seder, similar to what we know today, when we sit down on Passover for a Seder, was more a Middle Ages kind of thing. That it was evolving and evolving, but a true Seder that would be something that we would understand and recognize as a Seder was really a Middle Ages sort of construct. So, and certainly, I mean, it's continued to evolve, since then as well. We've got, as I said, we've got thousands of different Haggadot out there from different, vantage points, depending on how modern you want to be or how traditional you want to be. I just picked up the new revised copy of the one, the Maxwell House one at Publix, because I wanted to see if it had changed since the old one.
Changed in it. What did it change?
It seems some of the language has been updated. It was you'll remember the old one was very stilted in its language. And I think there's been an attempt to do away with that. I still find a lot of it's just sort of overdone, more so than it needs to be. And I realize that, at many Seders, people, do skip things. They don't do every single thing that's there, unless you go to Chabad or something where, every single thing, and then you're eating at 1 o'clock in the morning. But I wasn't impressed enough to think that I wanted to use it. Let's just put it that way. So, because we probably have 30 different Haggadot that we have at home. Some just because they're cool. We've never actually used them for Seder, and we've got some that are these uber, sort of hippy dippy, modern sort of, take on the Seder and whatever. But I think it's fun. What we've always done in the past is we kind of pick and choose from different, versions of the Haggadah and kind of create our own thing rather than relying just necessarily on one.
The one that I just mentioned, the 8th century Haggadah from Cairo, I just saw an article about that. That's what brought it to mind on that AISH, the AISH website that they had. I think it's in the Jewish Theological Seminary. I think they own it now, and it's had kind of a sordid history as far as where it went through and who bought it, and some of the pages were taken out, and a couple of pages were now re-auctioned off and things of that nature. But I think the Haggadah itself, but that's the earliest one that they've been able to find, supposedly, of anything that looks like a Seder.
Right. So, I mean, it's something that clearly was evolving, how to actually sit down and celebrate Passover, which is in the Torah. We are commanded to remember the story of the Exodus, which is why we have the retelling of it every single year. But the form that took was something that, was still ongoing until it came down to us today in the form that we know today as the Seder. I mean, it's historically, it's interesting to look at when you look at some of the older Seders, and you can see how things have evolved, and you can see how things have changed, a little bit. The basic elements are still there, but some of the prayers surrounding it have changed, and certainly updated language has come into the Seder. Certain things have been abbreviated that were much more lengthy in some of the older Haggadot that are out there. So it's kind of, his Passover and the Haggadah has just an interesting history all by itself.
We were talking the other day with the rabbi about Passover, and one of the things we were talking a little bit about was the difference between the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi. And he didn't think there were too many differences. We didn't have a long conversation on it between the Haggadahs. Do you have a Sephardic Haggadah?
We do not. That's something that now you put a sort of bug in me. That's something I'm going to make as one of my missions, is to find a completely Sephardic. I know that, what they eat is different. They are allowed to eat things that Ashkenazi are not. So I know that. But in terms of the way it's structured, the prayers, the blessings, etc., now I'm fascinated to kind of take a look and see, and do a compare and contrast between a traditional Ashkenazic Haggadah and a Sephardic Haggadah.
Yeah, I wonder if their Seder plate has anything, that would indicate that it's more Sephardic. Of course, I guess some of the Charosis kind of recipes could obviously be you know, dates.
Yes, I know that, yeah, Sephardic Harosis is more dates and figs rather than apples. You know, whereas in Ashkenazic, we are using chopped apples. But because I actually have seen a Sephardic Harosis recipe, and it is chopped dates, chopped figs. I've had Sephardic Harosis, and it's actually very delicious. It's very good. I like Harosis, period. But it's one of those things I always believe you make extra of, because I like eating it after the Seder as well as, during the Seder. But yeah, I would now that's going to be one of my little projects, is to sort of do a little compare and contrast between the Sephardic Seder and the Haggadah and the Ashkenazic Seder and the Haggadahs that we use primarily. Because there probably are some. I mean, there probably are some differences, maybe in structure, in that kind of thing. So, and that would be a very interesting discussion to have, is to have two sitting in front of you and looking at them sort of section by section, and just doing a comparison contrast between them.
Our congregation started as a Sephardic congregation, right?
Yes. With Mikveh Israel, it was Sephardic because they were from Portugal. I mean, they were Portuguese Jews. Other than a few Ashkenazic who were there as well, but it was a Sephardic congregation initially.
But would you say we're more Ashkenazic now?
Oh, for sure.
Oh, we're totally Ashkenazic. Are there any around that you're aware of that are Sephardic congregations in the Savannah or Atlanta area?
There was a very active, when we were in Fort Lauderdale, there was a very active Sephardic synagogue and congregation that was really not too far from where we lived. It was beautiful, beautiful building. We never got up the courage to go. I always thought it would be kind of interesting to attend a Shabbat service there, just for the sake of, the comparison and whatever. I'm not aware of any really close. I would think that maybe Atlanta very likely could have a Sephardic synagogue, perhaps. But I'm not exactly sure. The only one that I'm absolutely sure of because we used to drive by it all the time, was the one that was in Fort Lauderdale. And it was a fairly large, I believe they had, like 700 families in that particular.
We have several large ones in New Jersey, down by the Jersey Shore, that were Syrian Jews and Iranian Jews. And
right.
I think
East New York.
Yeah, East New York, I don't know if they're Sephardic.
Street.
Oh, yeah. There might be in Brooklyn. I'm sure there might be some.
There is one in New York City, because my brother lives in New York City, and he's talked about a Sephardic congregation that he has.
That old Portuguese synagogue. Remember that one that had the big fire when they were doing something in the attic there, and somehow I don't know, a welder ignited a flame and it burnt down. One of the most beautiful synagogues, in New York City.
Yeah,
I assume they're still Sephardic.
Right, I think so, as far as I know. I know that they do the Ladino rather than necessarily Hebrew for a lot of their music. Our cantor we had in Toledo, she knew a number of Sephardic tunes and whatever, and she would bring them into the service at times to Friday night service, and sing. We would sing, and she would teach us, some of the Ladino versions of some of the prayers, or some particular, extra songs to open the service or to close the service or whatever. It was always interesting because Ladino, it sounded very Spanish, just as Yiddish sounds very German. Ladino, it clearly has a very Spanish lilt to it. It's very pretty. It's a very pretty language. So, well, I don't know what to tell us about these poor guys who, got the axe because they sacrificed too much. I don't think any of us are particularly happy with the story and happy with the way it went down. But as I said, I don't pretend to speak for God, so I don't know what was in God's mind when he made this decision. So we just have to accept it as another one of those puzzlements of the Torah that we can't always completely understand today. But it's there for a reason. And maybe one of us will have a great light bulb moment at some point where they, aha, now I finally got it. But every year when I read it, I still don't. I would think every year that maybe something will strike me a little differently, because you read something one time and it strikes you one way and another time a different. But every year I get to it and I'm like, just throw up my hands and I don't know. I just don't know.
On a slightly different subject here, I took an Ollie class a couple of weeks ago. I'm trying to remember what class it was, but he happened to be talking about the power of ritual and the fact that, how ritual is necessary in the life of civilization, because it does bring people together for certain communal events and for things of that nature. I was never a big believer in the ritual by the book, so to speak. I thought rituals were kind of things that could be modified and changed and, adapted and things of that nature. And I know the Torah spends almost 2 books on ritual, if you count, Leviticus and Numbers, right?
Right.
And,
Yes.
you're almost got 2 total books on how to do things.
Exactly.
Is that where most of the 613 commandments come from? Those 2? Has anybody ever counted them up and stuff? I know that's something you probably do.
That where they exactly are located in the Torah. I mean, Leviticus is very, very heavy, on rules, laws, commandments and things of that sort. And I guess when, in terms of the ritual part of it, I always look at that. When I look at the fact that there is so much of the Torah that is devoted to what we would call ritual and the way to do things properly and whatever, is I have to go back in my head and think that this was a beginning. This was the start of a new civilization, a new culture, and they were being given guidelines for how to do things and how to live and how to honor God. And I think when I look at it from that sense that this is the beginning, this is the start, then that makes sense to me. As much as sometimes it gets tedious to keep reading the meticulous descriptions of sacrifices and things that don't seem relevant, but they needed guidelines and they needed some sort of way of establishing themselves. And part of the way any group of people does that is through, I guess, what we would call rituals, the way that we do things, the way that we approach things, the way that we understand things in life. And so from that standpoint, it makes sense to me, even if I do find it tedious. So, I mean, we still, as Jews, we still have ritual in our lives. I mean, every Shabbat, the things, the lighting of the candles and the blessing, when we have challah, the blessing when we have wine. The word Seder means order. It's a ritual. The entire Seder is a ritual. However loosely you do your Seder, or however, rigidly or tightly, compactly you do your Seder. We have ritual when we have synagogue services. And one of the interesting things that when I'm teaching Judaism 101 is the largest number of converts to Judaism come from Roman Catholicism. When you look at past religions, and part of that is because Roman Catholicism is very ritualistic as well. And so if you are converting from a religion that has a great deal of ritual to another religion where ritual is also important, there's a comfort level there, I think, for some people, beyond the theology of what they're looking for, the idea that I was in a religion that was ritual, and now I'm going to a religion that also follows there's comfort in ritual, I guess. So,
what do you find is the biggest obstacle when people try to embrace Judaism if they do come from Roman Catholicism? Is it the concept of Christ? Is being Savior, the Son of God, the Trinity kind of thing versus...
Now, I'm going to tell you the 2 things that seem to be the biggest point. Most people, when they have arrived at the point where they're considering becoming Jews by choice, when they're considering conversion, have already kind of in their minds, I think, dealt with the whole Jesus thing. And that's part of what is sort of driving them away from Christianity, is because they're having issues with the whole concept of Jesus as God, as Messiah, whatever. The biggest obstacles I find, and I have the conversations one-on-one sometimes with people who are converting, is they have a very difficult understanding of the Jewish concept of sin, because it's so different from the Christian concept of sin. And so they have a hard time wrapping their minds around sin is much more pounded in Christianity. And in Christianity, every single person is a sinner. And we don't have that concept in Judaism. Not that we don't sin, we do, but we are not thought of as inherently sinful beings, where in Christianity, you are an inherently sinful being. They have a hard time just getting themselves out of that mindset. and moving away from that. That's very, very difficult for them. The other difficulty is that, especially if they're coming into Reform, is that your concept of God, whatever that may be, is just that. It's your concept of God, and you have to make sense of it for you and understand it in a way that is meaningful to you, because we don't sort of say, this is what God is, and this is how you have to look at God, and this is how you have to believe in God. We get a lot more leeway in that. I mean, there are articles, I always give an article out to people in Judaism 101. Is it possible to be a good Jew and be an atheist? And the bottom line answer is yes and no. Yes, it is. There are atheistic Jews who are culturally Jewish, and we have a whole branch of Judaism called humanistic Judaism that has no mention of God anywhere. But they have synagogues, they have ritual, they still have the Torah, which, okay, whatever, because God's in the Torah. They do all the things, they celebrate the holidays, all of that, but they've completely taken God out of it. So if there's a whole branch of Judaism that has left God out of it, then I guess you can be an atheist and be a good Jew. Because if you're living a moral, ethical life, which is what we are commanded to do by the precepts of Judaism, then you're a good Jew. And this is very difficult for them. You mean I don't have to think of it this way? It's like, no. I said, if we go around the room and I ask everybody what their concept of God is, and there's 14 of us sitting here, we can get 14 different answers. And it's not that one's right and 13 are wrong. Whatever makes sense for you, for God, is what makes sense for you. So those two concepts are what I think they have the hardest time with.
Yeah. I would think also the concept of the central authority, the Pope, the final word, so to speak, the one who is the one who, is the end all and know all, so to speak, of everything that should be done, in their religion, compared to the diversity of opinion.
Right.
Which is what you say, God can be anything.
But Chabad is Schneerson is the Messiah.
Yeah, Jane says in Chabad, the Schneerson was thought to be, at least some
Right.
people thought that he was. So yeah, there are sects of Judaism, but that's more of one part of it. But the vast majority of Jews, I would think, are or different, or either in Reform or.
Well, because I tell them, I said, in Reform Judaism, and pretty much also in conservative Judaism, we don't have one big grand poobah rabbi, who is like the rabbi, who makes the proclamation, this is what they do. The CCAR, which, is the organization for Reform rabbis, gets together and talks, and they write responsa, and they discuss issues, and they make recommendations.
Right.
But ultimately, each Reform rabbi in his or her own congregation has a lot of autonomy in whether they choose to follow the recommendation or they choose not to follow the recommendation, and that's very, very different than a centralized authority where, this is what we've decreed, this is the way it's going to be, we're changing the service, it's going to be like this, and you have to do it this way. There's not a lot of leeway in a lot of the Christian denominations, whereas in Reform Judaism, and I say this, is that you can go into a Reform service, somewhere else, and yes, you're going to recognize things, but they may do things a little differently than what you're used to if you're used to Mikveh Israel. There's, local minhag, local custom. How do they do it? You may go into one where it's a little bit leaning more toward a lot more Hebrew. Another one where it's leaning toward much more English, It's it's each congregation and each rabbi that kind of decides where you're going to fall. The congregation I was in Ohio was a lot more Hebrew than what we do here in Mikveh Israel, a lot more Hebrew. I would say it was a good 70% of the service was Hebrew.
We were in New Jersey several years ago. We were at a meeting that they had, in which they had, is the Jewish Theological Seminary the the conservatives, right?
Conservative
So
seminary.
they had the first chancellor, I think, of the Jewish Theological Seminary, who was not a rabbi, had been elected several years ago. And he was a scholar, rabbinical kind of scholar. I think he was from Stanford or someplace. And he came, he was doing a tour, introduce himself to some of the major congregations. And he came to this one in New Jersey. And a couple of people asked questions that were pretty, incisive or argumentative about, why can't we make the service more appealing, so to speak, or shorter, or make it more interesting and things like this? And his answer was, we don't give guidance to the individual rabbis on those things. He says, we leave it up, and this is conservative now, we leave it up to them to find out ways to excite you about the service and get you interested in things like this. But we're not going to tell them that the service should be an hour and 15 minutes, or that you should do this and this, but not this and that, or stuff like that. So there's a lot of individual, even in the conservative.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, each rabbi, and I suppose, every synagogue, Reform, conservative, also has, some kind of, ritual committee or something where they sit down and talk, over, how services are going to be. And then if they want to implement certain changes, let's add this, or let's change the way we do this. And, people are resistant to change. We know that, one of the most common refrains you hear from people about anything is, well, we've never done it like that before. Well, because, people have to get used to something different. People have to get used to something new, and that's not always easy, but, sometimes you just have to make a change for a reason. But each rabbi and each committee within each synagogue has a lot of leeway in that. We don't have, someone decreeing you have to do it this way. It's not a from the top down kind of religion. Judaism is not. It's personal autonomy. Each person, each individual too. Like, each individual's concept of God, each individual who understands prayer in his or her own way, and all of that. We are, the one thing I've often heard said, and is that, Judaism, especially Reform and conservative specifically, I don't know about Orthodox as much, but I'm not as familiar. You have to be willing to think. It's not rote. It's not like those preachers out there who are telling you, this is the way you do it, and this is the way you have to think, and this is the way you have to believe. In Judaism, it's like, no, we don't do that for you. You've got to think it through on your own and come to your own conclusion.
And that's kind of the irony of Orthodoxy as well, because they spend so much of their time discussing and arguing, becoming rabbis, discussing the particular portions of the Torah in each, aspect of one will take this position, one will take another position, and they go back and forth. And so it's not even a uniform position there, it's the Hillel Shammai kind of dialogue that takes place, you light the Hanukkah candles left to right, you light them all at once, even those kind of things, get discussed, and that's why they say, the Jews make good lawyers.
And it's like, well, it comes down even like to the laws of kashrut, okay? I'm going to present the laws of kashrut to those who are going to convert, and ultimately you decide where in that spectrum of kashrut that makes sense for you. What of those, laws that govern what we eat spiritually makes sense to you, and that's ultimately what you really will follow in your own household. So, but in Orthodoxy, of course, I mean, I was just reviewing, I guess that's in my head, because I was just reviewing all the laws of kashrut, and it's dawned on me how utterly expensive it is to keep completely 100% kosher.
Yeah, very, very expensive. Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah, it's a whole different mindset as well.
Eating, dishes, storage space for dishes, storage space for food, etc. I mean, all of that. I mean, it's something you really have to think about if you want to keep kosher, because you really have to, everything that you buy, everything that you make, everything that you sit down to eat has to be thought through. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but it's something that takes a certain amount of time. You can't just decide that you're going to make some hamburger helper and be done with it, So, I think of Judaism as a religion that expects us to think and make sense of what we can make sense of and keep asking questions. I mean, our rabbi in Ohio, his favorite line was, the question is more important than the answer. He would tell us that all the time. The question is more important than the answer, because his theory was when you stop asking the questions, that's when you're in trouble.
Yeah. We have friends here in South Carolina that they have family in Israel, and they're ultra-Orthodox, and you live in one of these ultra-Orthodox communities, and she has conversations with her daughter, about trying to make life more easily, easier with more, kinds of modern things. And the daughter's response is, it's not supposed to be easy. We're supposed to be sacrificing. We're supposed to have hardships and things of that nature. So it's kind of like, we're not supposed to go out and enjoy ourselves constantly, party at Fort Lauderdale.
Right. Yeah, not too much anyway, not too much. We certainly have ability, but think about what we do. When we are supposed to think about what we eat, we are supposed to think about, because in terms of just health and taking care of ourselves, that's part of what we're commanded to do as well. And so I guess we really should think about what we eat. Before I break open that bag of potato chips, well, maybe not so much, So
I have to ask Terry a question.
Yes.
Terry, what is that picture that I see hanging on over your left shoulder? I'm looking at that picture.
It's a painting I bought from someone I knew, and I just love the colors in it. It's an Indian woman with henna tattoos.
That's interesting.
I couldn't make it out, but I see the reds and blush colors. It looks like a woman in a bathing suit almost. I couldn't really tell.
Let's see.
Oh, now I could see it. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you.
Interesting.
It's Indian.
Yeah.
Were you in India?
No, I loved the colors that stood out to me. And I had some money at the time. I was invited to an art gallery opening, and it was coincidental. It was my birthday, and I treated myself to
Right.
it. So
Art, I think art is one of those things you should buy when it speaks to you,
Right.
And the idea that when you see a piece and something about it speaks to you, that's to me the best way to buy art.
Yeah.
Speaking of art, the new season of Shtisel has started.
Yeah, I haven't started it yet.
So Jane and I just kind of went back to the previous season, since it's been a while, and just refreshed our memory, and we saw other two chapters there, but we just saw the first chapter of the other one, in which he is an artist, obviously, there, season 3.
Yeah.
And it's beautifully done. I mean, and it brings up the concept of art. It's almost like the Asher Lev kind of thing, or the Chaim Potok stories,
Right.
Of this kid in the Jewish community, but he's got these aspirations or this talent, and how does he break out, kind of thing. And it's a similar kind of thing, but it's also with it's a beautifully done series. Very, very beautiful.
It is.
So if you
it's
haven't
on right?
Netflix, yeah. Watch the first 2 seasons before you watch the third one.
I will. I
Right.
watched part of the first one, and then a lot of stuff started going on.
Yeah, and
Right.
if you get a chance,
I
I
haven't
think it's a beautifully done series. I mean, it just takes you inside the lives of people that you think you know something about, but you really know nothing about them, and they are ordinary human beings in many ways. Not that everybody isn't, but they have the same feelings and emotions and heartbreaks and disappointments. And,
Yeah, exactly.
But they live by a lot of rituals.
Yes, they do.
Yeah. But season 3 looks very promising.
Well, it's a highly lauded show for sure. I mean, it really, really is. I mean, when you read anything about it, I mean, critiquing, and the critics have all been pretty much universal in their praise of it. I mean, and that doesn't happen that often where something gets so universally praised, So, all right, everybody, have Chag Pesach Sameach.
Have a wonderful Passover. Maybe we'll see you Saturday night on Zoom.
Of course, Shabbat Shalom first, because we got Shabbat Shalom tonight. And then it's interesting because technically, I guess it's like Havdalah, and then immediately go into the Seder after that, because you would have the formal ending of Shabbat and then the beginning of, Passover.
Right.
Is the rabbi Seder Saturday night or Sunday night? The
Tomorrow, Saturday.
Saturday, that's what I thought, yeah.
Right. He's doing a children's something tonight, pre-Passover, something simple. He had like this little sort of coloring book, Haggadah, that I think he sent out to the families with young kids to download. And then I guess in today's email, he was sending out the link to, he put a Haggadah together himself. Sort of, there is a website where you can do that. It's, he says it's easy. We tried it one time. It was not so easy, but it'll be up on the screen. But I think you can also, it's a PDF. So if you wanted to print it out, you could print it out as well.
Yeah, because I think he said it's 6 o'clock tomorrow.
Tomorrow,
and
tomorrow 6
7, so
p.m.
you could have your Seder afterwards or something like
Right.
that and eat afterwards.
Right.
But, maybe we'll stop in for a while.
Right. All right, everybody. Have a great Passover, a good
Yeah.
weekend, and I will see you all next week.
Okay, Tim.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Happy Passover, everybody.
welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye.